After a hearty farmer's breakfast, we started out on foot towards the outpost. Finding an old logging trail, we decided to delve into the depths of the woodlands, and following the trail, we came to a spacious opening in the forest, the hand of a pioneer. At one end of the clearing lay an abandoned farmhouse in the shade of a few apple trees. As we stood gazing at the meadow, the roar of the sea, as it beat against the ancient bluffs, could be heard. And I knew my search was ended. Here, the clearing was to grow.
There is this place, the clearing, in Ellison Bay, Wisconsin. 125 acres of mostly woods, a few fields, high on the limestone cliffs overlooking the waters and the sunset of Green Bay. There are these buildings: main lodge, schoolhouse, pioneer cabin, cliff house. Moss-covered outcroppings of stone and log in such harmony with place, they look like they grew like mushrooms right out of the soil.
The ages have proven that a feeling of the soil is fundamental to all clear thinking. But we have never taken time to ask ourselves why this is true. Why people and nations go to sleep, follow false trails, and decay when they lose sight of the soil.
There was this man, Jensen.
He was very erect. Even in his 90th year, he was erect. And then he was always very well dressed.
He was a tall man, 6'1". One of the outstanding features were his eyes.
Very piercing.
They looked like two 5-carat blue diamonds.
He usually walked with a walking stick.
He was very proud of his Scandinavian Viking heritage. Oh, he bragged about it all the time.
Danish-born landscape architect, Jensen left Chicago his legacy of the entire West Side Park system and moved to Ellison Bay in 1935 to build his school. He was 75. Sid Telfer, Jensen's Door County neighbor, remembers.
I drove into there one day and he said, come here. And he took me over to an old building that they had there, his garage. And he says, I'm going to start a school. And I thought, what the dickens is the guy talking about? He's going to start a school. We got a school across the road here, and we got 5 public schools in this township, and it is way beyond me. And he tried to explain it to me, I suppose. I don't know, but it was way over my head. I didn't know what he was talking about. And then afterwards, I got to thinking about Frank Lloyd Wright had a school for architects, and I suppose this is going to be a landscaping school.
Modeled after the Danish folk schools for young adults, the clearing was to be a school for life. No lectures, no examinations, no credits. We do not teach, we help, was the way Jensen put it. It wasn't an easy concept for pragmatic Americans to grasp.
Nobody understands the clearing. Everybody wants to make a living, poor dears. They little realize that to make your living, first of all, you must learn to know yourself. At the clearing, we have our feet solidly planted in the soil.
Soil was a metaphor for Jensen. From it, all things would spring. After his first students of landscape architecture had gone home, classes in weaving began at the clearing.
There's something about weaving that's almost part of the soil. If you weave with natural fibers, as most of us like to do, think about it. Linen is flax. And flax is from the soil. If it's with silk, you have to have a mulberry tree before you can have a silkworm.
The curriculum continued to expand.
Teacher, 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 teacher. It may not sound like that to you. I've grown accustomed to listening to it that way. Teacher, 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 teacher. It's an ovenbird. It's one of the warblers, a woodland warbler. You'll see it low.
It's not just some artsy, crafty courses that they produce there. Not by any means. The philosophy courses, the French courses, the German courses. And not to say nothing of the potlucks. We could write 2 cookbooks on the potlucks alone.
Whether it's bird watching or chamber music, the course remains the same. As the sign just inside the stone gate declares, the clearing is a school for contemplation and study. The schoolroom is the great outdoors. The book is the self. It's a philosophy of education founded on the Danish folk schools of Jensen's youth. Hans Kierkegaard, another Danish-American who knew Jensen during the Chicago years, explains how the folk schools worked.
The Danish folk schools were not a school where you learned a lot of technical things. You learn about life itself, what really counted in life. Good food, good surroundings, next to nature, also to help your neighbors to live the same way as you live. No one could do anything in modern civilization without helping one another. It couldn't be done by one person. You all got to do it, and do it for the benefit of everyone. That's the principle of the Danish folk schools.
To start the week, I still like to use the prayer by Cardinal Cushing. Slow me down, Lord. Ease the pounding of my heart by the quieting of my mind.
Students share 3 meals a day, a class, and many of their feelings and experiences.
Give me amid the confusion of the day the calmness of the everlasting.
The meal times together, the sitting out in the chairs in the lawn, surrounded by woods, listening to the birds. All of these things, it just works on you. I don't consider myself really a talented writer, but I found myself writing things that I would have never, doing things I would have never believed I could do.
There is this clearing, then, more than 50 years later. People from 18 to 80 discover their private clearings here for a week or more, sometimes year after year.
There's the double meaning for the clearing. I mean, it's a clearing in the woods, and it's also a clearing out of all the clutter that's in your head, and you really are forced to look inward and think about things that you don't have a chance to think about when you're outside there in the big world. I mean, you really go one-on-one with yourself here.
It breathes you. You feel yourself growing airy, light, as space opens up inside you. You start noticing things, like the sound the rain makes in April, pattering on the leaves. Its intricacy, its eloquence, the way it speaks of self and others. The script for The Clearing was provided by another Door County native, Norbert Bly. I shouldn't say native because he also, like Jens Jensen, fled Chicago, and he teaches creative writing at The Clearing. With me this afternoon in my studio is one of my colleagues, I should say esteemed, Patricia Takemoto, who is the project administrator of Annenberg Project at WHA Radio. Patricia just completed her doctoral work on, she's a doctorate, she is a doctor of adult and continuing education, and she wrote her doctoral dissertation on The Clearing as an adult education institution in the Danish folk school tradition. Congratulations.
Thank you, Jean.
And welcome to the show. And we also have Erik Brynildson, a naturalist with the International Crane Foundation and a research assistant at UW's Department of Landscape Architecture. Good afternoon to you, and welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
What was it that made Jens Jensen, who had apparently searched long and hard for the perfect spot to found his school on, feel with such certainty that when he arrived in Ellison Bay and stumbled on The Clearing that this was it?
There's probably a number of reasons why Jensen identified with the Dore Peninsula. To start with, his boyhood home was on the what's known as the Jutland Peninsula of Denmark, and it's not unlike the Dore Peninsula in that it is on the Baltic Sea and is rocky and high above, and with the cliffs and the headlands of the Dore Peninsula. The other thing is that not unlike the Norwegians when they arrived in Ephraim, led by one A.M. Iverson, that when they came to the peninsula across Green Bay and first saw the soil. They grasped the soil in their hands and kissed it and just thanked the Lord for finding Ephraim. It was just a sacred place. And so I think that the Scandinavian heritage, whether it be Danish or Norwegian, which is popular on that portion of the Dora Peninsula, combined with just the physical geography of the place, I think was important to Jensen.
Mm-hmm.
So
it was the combination of elements that he found there. It was the approximation, the closeness to the water, and some special circumstances about that geography. Pat, tell us about the logo.
Oh, the logo for the clearing is a setting sun with a beautiful tree as in silhouette. To the Scandinavians, the presence of nature, the sunrises, spring times were very important, evocative times, I think because of their own shortness of sunlight in the northern latitudes. Jensen picked up on that and used the setting sun as his logo too. He said that as people would watch the sunset over Green Bay, it would give them hope for the next day.
Unusual. You'd think the sunrise would be a sign of hope, but in this case it was the sunset.
Yes, yes.
Or the midnight sun. So it's, in that sense, it was sort of a coming home for Jensen. He spent his last 16 years at the clearing.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've mentioned that soil was a metaphor for Jensen. In what sense was it a metaphor? Because he was literally talking about the soil as a landscape architect, after all. I mean, he was interested in growing things from the soil. But by extension, what else was it?
Like the tape we just heard, Jean said that Jensen strongly believed that everything was sprung from the soil. Whether it be the plants that he used in terms of his design materials or people, dust to dust. And so that he often said that when a dead tree falls in the forest, it provides the nutrition for seedlings then to grow again, and in that sense that tree never dies. It's a never-ending cycle of life.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about people springing from the soil?
He saw the soil to be the nurturer and the foundation, I think, for one's own sense of balance and perspective in life. He also, much like in the Danish folk school culture, felt that one needed to know one's own native heritage, and he felt that knowing the soil around you, the indigenous plants around you, made you a part of the region. He felt that the soil gave balance and perspective, that all men are brothers in the soil. The soil unites all people.
Mm-hmm. That sounds very conceptual and abstract, but actually there were very real political reasons why he felt this from his early experiences in the Danish folk schools.
Yes, the Danish folk schools were established in the 1840s and 50s, founded by a Danish bishop named Nikolai Grundtvig, as a reaction to the Prussian invasion of the Jutland Peninsula. It was an area long in contention between the Danes and the Germans, and when Bismarck invaded that area, the Danish folk schools sprung up as a way to protect the Danish heritage and culture, and as a way to provide another source of education other than Prussian education.
And so how did those principles from the Danish folk schools, how did Jensen adapt them to his concept of a school, which was originally intended as a school for landscape architects in Ellison Bay?
When Jensen was growing up in Denmark, he went to a Danish folk school and then to a Danish agricultural school. And the basic precepts of those schools was really not to prepare one for a career, not to steep one in book education, but to encourage one to gain an understanding of yourself, the individual, to perceive inner meanings, to build up your own personal philosophy of life, and therefore become a stronger citizen of your country. Mm-hmm. He called them schools for life, and so they were preparations for an entire viewpoint of life. Mm-hmm. Some of the major characteristics that Jensen adopted at the clearing from the Danish folk school were the living word. Grundtvig and Jensen also agreed that speaking and singing, communicating orally, captured the essence of individuals and current events. It intensified the intellect, they felt, because you could not substitute other people's words and book learning for your own mental activity, and you instead became the book. And so I think that the spoken word, the living word, as they call it, was a very important aspect of Danish folk schools.
And it survives at the clearing even today in the opportunities for extended leisurely conversation after meals on those occasions, those very important occasions when the students regroup.
Right. I think another important thing is the residential education. It's a dormitory setting of week-long classes, so students come there, and there are small groups of 25 students at one time. They go off and take 1 or 2 courses during the daytime, but regroup for meals, regroup in the evenings for conversations, and singing and conversations, talk after dinner, during dinner becomes a very important part of the clearing experience.
Which is also very similar to the Frank Lloyd Wright philosophy behind the Taliesin school experience. So as we look at the two Prairie School architects, we can draw lots and lots of parallels and analogies. Their tenure here on Earth, in fact, Wright got to be 90 and Jensen got to be 91, and their philosophies throughout their lives, we can keep on, as I said, drawing all kinds of parallels between the two men. And they did know each other. That's an interesting relationship in that they were both giants in their fields, and with that they both had giant egos, and they often clashed on projects. But they were both very colorful men, and actually their work complemented each other's work very well.
Now, it seems that Jensen had a greater success in blending into his adopted environment in Wisconsin than Frank Lloyd Wright did, and in developing strong contacts among the local people.
I would say that Frank Lloyd Wright, in that sense, was more cosmopolitan, and probably we can't say that Wright didn't employ local people. He employed local masons, local carpenters. Local people would plow the fields at Taliesin. Jensen was a strong believer as well in using people that were indigenous to the region or to the area. Frank Lloyd Wright was probably a bit more flamboyant, certainly, than Jens Jensen, so he did probably was a more controversial figure locally than Jensen.
I think also Wright's creation of Taliesin came in the midpoint in his career, whereas for Jensen, the clearing was really the culmination of his landscaping career. It was his last creative act, and he lived from the time that he created the school, 75 years old, until 91 years old at the clearing. He died at the clearing and really devoted the last years of his life to the school. So he was he spent his last years in Wisconsin, and I think Wright instead went on to other...
Scottsdale, Arizona, Taliesin West became Wright's primary home then during the same, say, last 16 years of his life or more. I would agree with you, Pat, that the clearing in a landscape architectural sense is perhaps the greatest expression probably the closest thing to a complete success that Jensen had in merging man and nature, and it's a real masterpiece in that respect.
And it's in the right place, isn't it?
It's certainly in the right place, and especially as Door County becomes more and more developed, as it's becoming rapidly, the clearing becomes more sacred with each year.
Yeah. In fact, they say that the clearing is one of the best kept secrets of Door County. It's a beautiful location, 125 acres of wooded woods and cliffs facing Green Bay. Its school is now on the National...
it's on the National Register of Historic Places, right. Yes it is.
We're going to find out more about the proportion of people to land that Jensen had in mind, and how the clearing has managed to preserve that ratio in just a minute, but I want to give our listeners a chance to become involved with us on the air. You can call us if you're listening in Madison and Milwaukee at 263-1890. 263-1890 is the local number. Elsewhere around the state, the number is toll-free, 1-800-642-1234. 1-800-642-1234. We're talking about Jens Jensen, the Danish-American who founded the small but famous school for contemplation and study in Ellison Bay, Wisconsin, that is still very viable today. It's called The Clearing, and my guests this afternoon are Pat Takemoto, who has done her doctoral dissertation on the subject, and Erik Brynildson, a naturalist with the International Crane Foundation and a research assistant at UW's Department of Landscape Architecture. Today on All Things Considered, NPR's Joe Magalino reports on President Reagan's trip to Florida to attend the memorial service for those who died on the USS Stark. Also, the golden anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge. We'll meet John Vanderzee, author of a book about the span and the people who built it. That's later on All Things Considered, beginning here on Wisconsin Public Radio at 4. Jens Jensen had a very extravagant notion of what the individual's right to wander and get lost was. Pat, will you tell us what the ratio of people to land was that he had in mind?
The clearing is comprised of about 125 acres, and Jensen's formula was that there should be 5 acres per student. So in his program for the school, he said that there should be only 25 students that could be accommodated at the school at one time. The clearing still serves 25 to 30 students at one time, so they are very much in keeping with that same ratio, agreeing with Jensen that you need space around yourself to get away. I think that the clearing, because of its beautiful setting, really becomes not only an opening in the woods, surrounded by trees which become the buffer from the modern world, but it becomes a spiritual retreat for the mind and the heart, and it's a place for reflection and relaxation, renewal and refreshment. And I think that all of that does occur because it's not a crowded place.
It's interesting to note with that even with that liberal spatial ratio that we just mentioned, Jensen himself constructed a private cliff house that is built into and hugs the escarpment there above Green Bay, and that was, as he said, just to get away from the students. So he did very much value solitude and privacy.
I'm so glad you brought that up. In my visit to the clearing, I was quite taken with the cliff house and the idea that it was a retreat within a retreat, and that was where you could hear the waters of Green Bay crashing against the limestone cliffs below, and the furniture in this little niche, this grotto carved out of the rock that he himself created. The furniture is made out of birch logs, and it's the most Spartan imaginable. Go ahead, tell us more about it.
It's almost like Thoreau's cabin at Walden in the sense that everything that's there is necessary. It's the ultimate in simplicity in how it's furnished. I've had occasion to experience the cliff house watching a large thunderhead roll across Green Bay, and then afterwards the rapturous sunny skies that followed the storm. And at that moment, it was when I felt Jensen's presence the strongest. It's often said that people that do attend the school at the clearing do feel some sort of a sense of mystery or a powerful presence and maybe perhaps Jensen's spirit. And I know I've felt that on more than one occasion. Pat, I think you have too. It's that kind of place. It's a very powerful place.
We have a Door County caller who'd like to join us. Hi. Door County, you're on the air.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, you're on the air.
Okay. I live in Door County, obviously, and I've had the pleasure and opportunity to perform there musically in winter at the clearings programs in winter. But there's only one gripe I've got, and it is a gripe. You have people here talking on the program, and I know what it costs to go to the clearing for a week in summer or whatever. And this is a rich man's game. And if all your guests and all these people you have on the program would quit their rhapsodizing about the clearing, which is a beautiful place, I'm not denying that. It's a wonderful experience. It's beautiful up there. But if they would put their efforts into creating more clearings and price them in the range for the factory workers and for the people who don't have access and can't afford and don't know about places like that, we could go a long ways in creating a more environmental ethic, such as Aldo Leopold talked about, and turn this country around a little bit.
I can't imagine a question.
And that really aggravates me because basically, no matter how the clearing is a simple place. It is Spartan. But it is still a rich man's game. It is not, as Marx might have called it, a proletarian place. And we need more of that in this country. And I wish more clearings would be established by these people who come up there and rhapsodize about it. I wish they get off their butts and do more about it. The people who do have the money and do have the access to create more of those kind of places all around the country, because it isn't the only beautiful place in the county, and it isn't the only beautiful place in the country.
I can't imagine a question that would be more at the heart of Jensen's philosophy than that one. Pat, would you like to tackle that?
Yes, I certainly agree that there should be more clearings created. I guess I was just looking at the program schedule here, and what the gentleman was just talking about was the tuition for a week at the clearing, which is running $380 for a twin-bedded room. That does include a full week of instruction, all meals, 3 meals a day, and accommodations for that full week. I guess that the only thing that we can compare it to is if a person were to take a Door County vacation for a week in a motel or a hotel around there, they probably would be paying that amount, if not more, just for accommodations and meals.
Quite a lot more, I might add.
Yeah. But the real question, I think, the larger question that the Door County caller raises is that there was a constant struggle from the very beginning. A lot of people really criticized Jensen for being a poet primarily, that his philosophy and of education and the foundation of the school is really, in a sense, untenable. You know, how in this day and age, or in any day and age, can you allow
a full week of instruction, all meals, 3 meals a day, and accommodations for that full week? I guess that the only thing that we can compare it to is if a person were to take a Door County vacation for a week in a motel or a hotel around there, they probably would be paying that amount, if not more, just for accommodations and meals.
Quite a lot more, I might add.
But the real question, I think, the larger question that the Door County caller raises is that there was a constant struggle from the very beginning. A lot of people really criticized Jensen for being a poet primarily, that his philosophy and of education and the foundation of the school is really, in a sense, untenable. You know, how in this day and age, or in any day and age, can you allow an individual to his own private 5 acres of land to roam around in and commune with himself, and yet, because in this country, bigger is better. And in order to follow the idea of progress, you'd have to violate the very spirit of the school. And there has been a constant financial struggle. And the school has endured for 50 years or better now, but always on the brink of financial disaster.
Yes, and actually these costs really only recover the cost of operations there.
Instructors and so on.
Yes, there was a parallel, I think, that was drawn by some people to the elder hostel programs that are occurring at university campuses, which are probably $150 less than this, but they're subsidized by state tuitions, or they're subsidized by the administration that benefits from keeping other accommodations open for the summer, things that would go empty otherwise.
Also, the program format with Elder Hostel is a bit different in terms of what courses they offer.
Right.
So that should be pointed out.
Go ahead.
I guess it does bring up the point that you raised, Jane, about it. The story of the clearing is one of 50 years of struggle just keeping the school alive, and the clearing is still in that same situation. It has been affiliated with the Wisconsin Farm Bureau Federation for the last 30 years or so, and they provided some financial stability to the operation of the school. The school will be going independent in 1988, and there's a major fund drive going on right now to establish its independence. It's trying to raise about $1 million in capital and endowment funds to keep the school alive. So schools like this are fragile operations.
That's right, and we can draw another analogy between Frank Lloyd Wright and Jens Jensen here, in that both schools, whether it's the Taliesin Foundation or the Clearing, are a bit in the shape they're in, or through cultural changes. That would be, I think, the greater issue here. Taliesin, in other words, is also in financial difficulty. So, in that sense, that Wright's product is very much like Jensen's.
But Taliesin is a professional school.
That's right. It's a professional school. It's unlike the Clearing in the sense that the public is not invited there for a week at a time for classes and that kind of thing. You have to apprentice.
And you know, I was really struck by what the Door County Caller said, because I think the idea that factory workers should have equal access to an environment in which the things that make life worth living are nurtured is something that Jens Jensen would have been almost dedicated his life to.
Yes, yes.
He would have been unhappy to discover, if it is in fact true, that the Clearing had turned into an elitist operation that was only for the people who are already highly educated and cultured.
Jensen liked to, commonly he referred to himself as a simple farm boy at heart, and that's right. He certainly wouldn't, last thing he would have wanted was for it to become an elitist operation.
And when you consider what he did in Chicago with the park system and why he did it, it makes perfect sense. You were mentioning, Pat, earlier that he worked with Jane Addams in settlement houses in Chicago, and was very dedicated to the idea that the children should be able to get out of the tenement structures and into...
Yes, he created school grounds and school playgrounds in Chicago when he was still there for the children, and he in fact recommended that for the summer, school children should just be bused up to Wisconsin to spend the summer in the woods. I would like to also say that the tuition at the Clearing really only does cover costs right now. I guess we need to just sort of compare the cost of other kinds of operations of this type, and also that there are scholarships available provided by the Friends of the Clearing for people who might also need some financial assistance in attending the school.
We move to a Racine caller now. Hi, you're on the air.
Yes, I'm very interested in what you're saying. I've been to the Clearing, and I have been in small groups with Jensen. In fact, I spent a weekend in the Clearing just as he was beginning the school. And the more specific comments, the description of Jensen's attitude toward the soil was of particular interest to me. When Jensen spoke of the soil, he was almost speaking poetry. He had what I can only describe as reverence for the soil. And I was glad to hear a little elaboration of that, so that I now understand a little better what Jensen was saying when he talked about the soil. And I myself share his attitude deeply, because the soil is one of our most misunderstood, neglected, and abused natural resources.
I'm interested to hear that you attended one of the first
schools at the clearing. Tell us more about that, if you would.
I did not attend a school. I visited there with a group of students from the landscape department at the University of Wisconsin when the buildings were still under construction. And so I was never a student in the school itself. But that was a great privilege. We had our meals, there were only a dozen of us or so, and Jensen was at the meals, of course, and it was he who spoke to us.
One of my favorite things that Jensen was fond of saying is that before one aspires to become a landscape architect, they need to grow cabbages first. And I think that sort of philosophy really tells us what kind of thinker in terms of what kind of reverence he had for the soil. Another good example would be that even in his 85th year, he was out there with a hand pickaxe and shovel digging out the root cellar that's presently at the clearing out of the chunks of Niagara escarpment. So he was that kind of man.
Yes, very much so. And yet he was, his personality was so big that it inevitably dominated any group of which he was a member. He was just that kind of a person.
So you recall that he had a very powerful presence then?
Yes, almost overwhelming. And if I could just mention about the Cliff House, that is really a unique place. When I visited the clearing as a student a number of years ago, under the present program, I slept one night down there in the Cliff House, and to me that was one of the greatest privileges I've ever had.
Some people have said that it's scary.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
You're isolated. The path up to the main buildings is narrow and steep and a little precarious, and it's really a climb down into the Cliff House. But I've never slept in any place that came near it, and its isolation was essential to the sense of it as a place to sleep or to be.
Go ahead.
And another thing I would like to add to what's been said is that it's my understanding that Jensen was the originator of the forest preserve system in and around Cook County.
That's right.
He actually was responsible for the expansion of the Chicago Park system in 1918. He drafted a proposal for the state parks of Illinois in 1926.
I see.
Yes, he was very instrumental in the development of the Chicago Park system.
He also designed a series of parks along Root River here in Racine.
That's correct, yes. He did.
And that is really a unique thing, and he wrote a report to the city park department, I think in 1910 or 11, advocating that the city acquire all of the riverbank and the whole lakefront.
That's interesting. That should be pointed out too, I think, that Jensen was, beyond his role as a landscape architect, he was an activist, and he was quite a letter writer. He got involved in not only the salvation of many areas that were threatened, natural areas that were threatened, but also he was instrumental, say, in the creation of the Door County Park system, including the Ridges Sanctuary, which was its first 40 acres was dedicated just 50 years ago yesterday. So he was beyond just landscape architect. He was a real interpreter of nature to begin with.
He also played a major role in the creation of the Indiana Dunes State Park.
That's right.
Too, which was a major controversy with the oil industry down there.
I need to give out telephone numbers again. 263-1890 if you're listening in Madison or Milwaukee and you want to get in on our conversation about Jensen and the school he founded for contemplation and study in Ellison Bay, Wisconsin called The Clearing. 263-1890. Otherwise, it's toll free 1-800-642-1234. 1-800-642-1234. And thanks so much, Racine Caller, for sharing so much with us.
Thank you.
Today on All Things Considered, NPR's Joe Maglino reports on President Reagan's trip to Florida to attend the memorial service for those who died on the USS Stark. Also, the golden anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge. We'll meet John Vander Zee. That's a bridge-like name, if I've ever... It must be because of the Zuider Zee I'm thinking of. Author of a book about the span and the people who built it. That's coming up at 4 on All Things Considered, beginning here on Wisconsin Public Radio in about 45 minutes. Also, I'd like to make a plug for next Friday's program, which will also be about Door County, with Norbert Bly, the author of a trilogy on Door County. We have a number of callers who are ready to join us. Let's go to Hayward. Hi.
Hi. I first want to say that your program is absolutely delightful from morning to night, and I don't know what I would do living in Hayward, Wisconsin without it.
Oh, good to hear.
Jensen is the grandfather of a lifelong friend of ours, and we have heard about the clearing forever and ever and ever, and I wondered if today's program is taped or if there's a transcript of it, and if this would be available to him.
Yes, you can certainly have access to the tape, and you can do that by calling Ev Lori at Wisconsin Public Radio.
All right, can you give me that number?
Will you call the production assistant, and all those technical things can be handled through him again.
So I'll just call back the 1-800 number?
Yes.
Fine.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm. Bye.
Bye-bye. Let's go to, where are we? This is Appleton, aren't you? There? Hi.
Hello. Yes, I just, in regards to the price of the clearing, and
I really have to say that we aren't permitted to talk about prices and costs on the air. We've really gone too far in that direction.
I've traveled all over Wisconsin, or I consider myself I love Wisconsin. I've been in all 48 lower states and pretty close to Alaska. And whatever the case, I was born in Wisconsin, and my grandparents immigrated from. I consider myself a Polish Gypsy Jew and an Ethiopian Polak.
How wonderful!
I immigrated from all parts of the world to Wisconsin, and I traveled away from it, and I came back to it. And on hearing this program, I really feel good about making contact with that organization and traveling and seeing that experience and accepting it. I'm a photographer, among other things, and that seems to be a world of creative thought that just lies waiting for me to explore it. And I want to thank you and your guests. And of course, I've gone to the University of Wisconsin. I've majored in so many things that I never managed to graduate in any of them. But I do want to thank you for existing. And
Jensen would not hold that against you.
Not as far as a lack of a college degree.
Right.
In fact, he was given an honorary degree by the university in 1937, but never earned one.
Okay, we are going to go to a Madison caller now. You're on here.
Hello. I've heard that the council ring out in the Arboretum was done by Jensen in memory of his son, and I wondered if that's true.
Yes, it is. It's a memory of his grandson, who was a student at the University of Wisconsin and was a young man, I think 22 years old, and died suddenly. And Jensen came up and built and designed and dedicated the council ring in the Arboretum grounds to him. And right across the street from the Arboretum grounds, the Glenway Children's Park was one that Jensen designed in the late 1940s. It used to be a city dump, and it's a beautiful, dramatic gully, children's park now with another council ring on the top there, too.
That provides us with an opportunity to talk about the way Jensen used indigenous materials and the indigenous philosophy that he found in Ellison Bay and integrated these elements into the clearing. One is the council ring, which he adapted from the Native Americans.
Right. He felt that he was inspired by the American Indians and their campfires, and he felt also that in a circle no one is superior to another, everyone is equal.
It also represents then that holistic circle or cycle of life that it keeps coming up with the soil level thinking and all that. So in a sense now with the new and emerging field of landscape restoration ecology, Jensen can be called really a pioneer in that field. recognizing that indigenous plant materials and even restoring with the use of native plant materials was the correct way to go. And we're just now, I think, beginning to understand what it takes to revive land. And so we can look back to some of the work that Jensen's done, even in urban settings, and draw upon it.
Okay, we go to Green Bay now. Hi.
Hello. I grew up in Oak Park, Illinois, a few blocks from Columbus Park. Did Jens Jensen design that?
Yes, he did.
He did. Okay. That was kind of like almost like a fantasy for me when I was a kid, living, in an urban setting, and then being able to go to this place that had forests, and I think there was a waterfall and prairies.
There's an interesting story, I'll be brief, about that park. Jensen looked upon his expression of art, we'll say, as an interpretation of nature, not unlike, say, Mozart compositions or Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. Goethe put it well when he said that he called architecture frozen music. The chief contractor on the construction of Columbus Park couldn't quite get the feeling of the waterfall, as you mentioned, and the brook down, so Jensen handed him a copy of Handel's Water Music and said, go home tonight and listen to that, and in the morning I think you'll understand what I'm trying to do here. And indeed it did work.
Oh, wow.
That's a perfect illustration of the way he integrated in his thinking all of these disciplines that unfortunately we've come to think of as separate from one another, but aren't at all.
I sort of consider the clearing as Jensen's prairie school in another play on words of the prairie school. I think it's an American hybrid in which he combined aspects of the Danish folk school and of progressive education. He knew about John Dewey, worked with Jane Addams, felt that teachers shouldn't set all the directions, that really the students should be the ones who set their own goals. The teachers were there to assist in the instruction. Populist education was brought in there with the Wisconsin Farm Bureau Federation, and a liberal studies aspect was added in the 50s after Jensen died from the University of Chicago. So I think in that way, too, the clearing really has integrated a lot of different kinds of educational philosophies.
Well, he was a man, I hesitate to use the word visionary, but I think in his case it really is an accurate term. But why is it, with all of these accomplishments that our callers have brought out this afternoon, that he isn't better remembered? Why is it that Frank Lloyd Wright is a commonplace on everyone's lips, but Jens Jensen is somebody you always have to explain?
I think one of the things is that the medium that he worked in, the field that he was in, landscape architecture, is such a growing and organic field. So if his creations were not kept up, if Columbus Park was not kept up, then even 5 years later, you don't see the full impact of that person's work. Whereas if you're working in stone and
there's
brick,
definitely a real difference between design when you're dealing with materials that are no longer living versus those that are. When you're dealing with living plant materials, you have to have a bit of a vision, if you are a good landscape architect, to somehow get a mental picture of what the composition is going to be like 50 years down the road or 100 years down the road. So oftentimes your design really doesn't come into full blossom until you're long dead. And so in that sense, I think landscape architecture is a bit more hard to keep a handle on.
And actually, maybe the clearing is the most permanent aspect of his legacy instead.
Nina, you're on the air.
Yes. The clearing seems pointed toward people of a contemplative, philosophical, poetic, artistic nature, which are not run-of-the-mill people, but are rather uncommon people. Most of us want to go, even in the national parks, and have golf courses there and lunch stands and so on, and then we feel at home, even in the midst of such tremendous, outstanding scenery. So the clearing, in order to be natural and left unmolested by the most of us, it has to appeal to uncommon people, to be left in its natural beauty. Is everything natural at the clearing rather than formal flower beds? Is it all Wisconsin plant life?
There are some plants that you would see there that are there just for their color, we'll say. I can think of instances on the grounds at the clearing where I've seen plants that aren't native, but they're there to, say, highlight stone, perhaps log and mortar, which a lot of the cottages are. They've been moved from another part on the peninsula. They really are old pioneer log houses. So no, it isn't. It's certainly not a formal English or French garden in the sense of topiary and that sort of thing. It's very naturalistic, we'll say, and it does emphasize the use of indigenous stone and wood and certainly native plant materials.
I was just up there last weekend for the Friends meeting, and there are fields of trilliums and lady slippers and hepaticas in bloom. So it is much more like a woodland setting than a golf course.
Certainly.
I want to thank the two of you for being with us this afternoon. I've enjoyed this discussion immensely, and I can only hope that our listeners have as well. We've been talking with Pat Takemoto, who just completed her doctorate in adult and continuing education. She wrote her dissertation on the clearing as an adult education institution in the Danish folk school tradition. We've also spoken with Erik Brynildson, naturalist with the International Crane Foundation, research assistant, UW Department of Landscape Architecture. I'd like to end with a poem that I think is very much in keeping with the spirit of the discussion today, Morels. A certain faith in the nearly invisible is useful in a morel hunt, like a head shrunken to a fist, pitted and pulped where the cerebrum should be, as if the speech center is the first section of the mind in this climate to waver. But where we are right now, Pine Woods, Wisconsin, silence among you and I, and your Norwegian grandfather is the argot of deep trust. The forest floor sparkles with the white flakes of the snow. Trillium, here and there, are deer tracks feeding killdeer, foxgloves by the brook in the clearing. Beyond the words of caution, the farmer up the scree is a Nazi. We break the silence only as we stumble upon a conclave of these brain mushrooms, the earth beginning to hold our vision, so totally we become neither oak nor snake, but a movement among the lowest branches, shadows really, dappled forms rooting in the wood rot and damp. The humus conspiring, relinquish the secret that astonish, the edible flesh of silence. That's a poem written by Credo James Enriquez, and I found it, as usual, in the Wisconsin Poets Calendar, 1987. Coming up is Monitor Radio that we join in just a few seconds, and then today on All Things Considered, NPR's Joe Migalino reports on President Reagan's trip to Florida to attend the memorial service for those who died on the USS Stark. Also, the golden anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge will meet John Vander Zee, author of a book about the span and the people who built it. That's coming up at 4 on All Things Considered. On Monday's program, we'll have Tom Miller, who was very instrumental in the whole organization of the new Vietnam Memorial that is about to be constructed in Madison. He'll be on the program at 2:30 on Monday afternoon. I'm Jean Feraca. Thanks for being with me. Have a good weekend.